I remember the exact sound it made. Not a click. Not a pop. Not the smooth mechanical exhale of a lock finally giving way after years of resistance. It was more like a sigh. Like something long held in, finally, after 30 years of silence, being allowed to breathe again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before that moment, before the rusted iron door swung open on hinges that screamed like they'd forgotten how to move, I was just a woman standing in a muddy field in rural Tennessee. Holding a $4 receipt, wondering if I had completely lost my mind. The auctioneer had laughed. Not cruelly, just with that particular kind of amusement reserved for people who bid on things nobody else wants. Sold, he'd said, pointing at me with a lazy finger, to the lady in the green jacket. A few people turned to look. One older man shook his head slowly, like he was watching someone make a mistake they couldn't take back. The railroad car had been sitting on a forgotten stretch of track behind a decommissioned freight depot outside of Cookeville for as long as anyone could remember. The depot itself had closed in 1993. The car had been there before that. It was locked with a mechanism nobody recognized, not a standard rail padlock, not anything the yard workers had a key for. 3 decades of Tennessee summers and winters had welded it shut with rust and time and whatever stubborn secrets lived inside. For dollars. That's what it cost me. For dollars to buy something no one could open, something everyone had given up on, something that had been sitting in the same place, untouched, for 30 years. I didn't know then that the story inside that car would reach back across time and completely rewrite the story I thought I knew about my own life. I didn't know that $4 would be the most important money I ever spent. But standing there in that wet Tennessee field, receipt in hand, the autumn light going copper and cold around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like something was waiting for me. And it was. I have a complicated relationship with letting go. My name is Marisol Bauer. 38 years old. Former logistics coordinator for a mid-sized freight company out of Nashville, which is, looking back, almost painfully on the nose, a woman whose entire job was tracking what goes where. Making sure nothing got lost, ensuring every package arrived exactly where it was supposed to be. And then my own life went completely off the rails, which is also, I realize now, embarrassingly on the nose given where this story ends up. I'd spent 12 years at Hartwell Freight Solutions. 12 years of spreadsheets and cargo manifests and phone calls at 6 a.m. from truck drivers stuck in Georgia. I was good at it. I was methodical and calm, and I had a color-coded system that my supervisor called aggressively organized, which she meant as a compliment. I had a routine. I had a small house in East Nashville with a porch I never sat on. I had a relationship with a man named Derek who was perfectly fine in all the ways that don't ultimately matter. And then, inside of about 8 months, all of it dismantled itself. Derek left, not dramatically, not with a fight, just with the quiet certainty of someone who had made up their mind long before they said the words. The company restructured. My position was eliminated with a handshake and a severance package that felt, somehow, more insulting than nothing at all. And my mother, my sharp, difficult, private, complicated mother, Elaine, died in March, leaving behind a house I didn't know what to do with and a grief I didn't know how to hold. The grief for my mother was different from what I expected. We weren't close. That's the honest way to say it. She was a woman who kept her interior life locked behind very thick walls, and I had spent most of my adult life either trying to get through those walls or pretending they didn't bother me. When she died, I didn't cry at the funeral. I stood at the graveside in the cold and felt something strange, not sadness exactly, but a kind of vast, hollow bewilderment. Like I'd been waiting my whole life to understand her, and now I never would. She left me almost nothing. The house in Murfreesboro, mostly debt. A box of miscellaneous items the estate lawyer described as personal effects. And a handwritten note, just one line, no explanation, that said, some things are worth finding. Even when the door won't open. I didn't understand it. I put it in a drawer and tried not to think about it. But grief has its own gravity, and curiosity has its own kind of hunger, and so 3 months after my mother died, on a Saturday morning with nothing particular to do, I drove out to a railroad property auction in Cookeville because I'd seen it listed online and thought, I don't know what I thought. Maybe I just needed to go somewhere. Maybe I needed to feel like I was moving. The auction was held at the edge of what had once been the Cookeville branch freight yard, a sprawling, rusted geography of forgotten infrastructure, coils of old track, collapsed wooden platforms. A depot building with most of its windows replaced by plywood and weather. About 40 people had come out. Serious buyers with clipboards, a few resellers in work boots, some curious locals. The auctioneer was a lean man named Gary who had the practiced, rapid-fire patter of someone who'd been doing this since before I was born. Most of the lots were mundane. Old signage. A storage shed full of rotted railroad ties. Maintenance equipment that looked like it had been manufactured during the Eisenhower administration. People bid with the focused indifference of professionals, and I stood near the back feeling completely out of my depth. Then Gary gestured toward the back of the lot. It sat on a short stretch of original track that disappeared into weeds on both ends, going nowhere. A standard boxcar, maybe 50 feet long, the old dark red faded to a kind of exhausted brown, the lettering on the side so weathered it was nearly illegible. The sliding door was secured by a lock that wasn't standard. It was a large, heavy mechanism, almost like a custom vault latch, with no visible keyhole in the conventional sense. Lot 47, Gary said, and his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, just a slight flattening of his showman's energy. Old freight car. Been on this property since before the depot closed in '93. Previous owners couldn't determine original carrier or manifest. Lock mechanism is non-standard, no key on record. Sold as is, contents unknown if any. Opening bid, for dollars. There was a silence. Genuine, awkward, collective silence. For dollars was practically Gary's way of saying, this is not a real auction item. It was a liability. It was a problem in a metal shell. It had probably been sitting there accumulating legal and structural ambiguity for 30 years, and whoever bought it would have to figure out how to deal with it. I raised my hand. I don't fully know why, even now. Some part of me registered that no one else was going to, and something about that felt wrong. Something about that felt like the car deserved better than to sit there in that field forever, unclaimed, never opened, contents unknown, going quietly to rust and nothing. Something about it reminded me of my mother. Sold, Gary said, pointing at me, and the man beside me murmured, good luck with that, hun, in a tone that suggested I would need considerably more than luck. I paid my $4 in cash. They handed me a transfer of title that was more confusion than clarity and a property notation that said the car and its contents, whatever those might be, were now mine to deal with. I stood there looking at it for a long time after the auction ended and most people had gone. The light was getting low. The lock was the color of old blood. Some things are worth finding, even when the door won't open. I took a photograph of the lock and drove home. What followed was 6 weeks of the most unexpectedly absorbing project of my life. I won't pretend it was romantic at first. The first weekend I drove back out to the freight yard with a toolbox and a YouTube education in vintage railroad hardware. I was mostly just cold and confused. The lock was unlike anything I could find in any reference database I searched. It had a lever mechanism instead of a tumbler, but the levers were arranged in a configuration that didn't match any of the lever lock patents I found from the early 20th century. There were markings on the housing, small, precise stampings, that looked like they might be a manufacturer's code, but nothing I could trace. I photographed every inch of it and sent the images to 3 different antique lock specialists. 2 didn't respond. The third, a man in Pennsylvania who ran a niche blog about historical railroad security hardware, emailed back within 2 hours with one line, "I've never seen anything like this." "Where did you find it?" We had a long phone call. His name was Arthur Grimm, which I thought was a lot for one person to carry, and he was 70 years old and had been collecting railroad locks for 45 years. He told me that certain private freight companies in the early to mid-20th century commissioned custom locking mechanisms for high-value or sensitive cargo. Not government contracts, private arrangements. He'd heard of it but never seen one in person. "What's the car number?" he asked me. I read it off my photograph. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, that's a Southern Appalachian regional designation. They were a small carrier. Defunct by 1987. Do you know anything about them?" "Not much. Small family operation. Mostly ran through Tennessee and into western North Carolina." A pause. "You know, there were rumors, years ago, that SAR had a car that went missing from their manifest. Not stolen, just sort of administratively lost. No one could figure out where it had gone. The company folded before anyone sorted it out." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up. A car that had gone missing. Sitting in a field. 30 years. I went back every weekend. I brought better tools. I read everything I could find about lever lock mechanisms and started approaching it less like a problem to force and more like a conversation to have. And slowly, through careful measurement, through trial and error with handmade shims I cut from sheet metal following Arthur's guidance over video call, it began to give. Not all at once. The rust fought back. 2 of my improvised tools snapped. I bruised my palm badly against the housing one afternoon when something slipped. And I sat down in the dead grass beside the car with my hand throbbing and the November sky going the color of old pewter, and I felt, absurdly, absolutely certain that I needed to see what was inside. 6 weeks and 3 days after I bought it, the mechanism moved. And the door, with that sound, that long, slow sigh, swung open. The smell hit me first. Not rot. Not mold, exactly, though there was an undertone of age and damp, more like the inside of an antique store, that particular mineral. Paper and wood fragrance of things that have been still for a very long time. The air that came out was different from the air around it. Older. Private. I stood at the threshold for a full minute before I stepped in. The interior was dim, lit only by the grey November light coming through the open door. As my eyes adjusted, shapes resolved out of the darkness. It was full. Not crammed, not chaotic, carefully, deliberately full. Like someone had packed it the way you pack something you intend to protect. Wooden crates stacked against the walls, each one sealed with slats and labeled in handwritten ink that had faded to near invisibility. A large canvas tarpaulin was draped over a central mass of objects. I could see the angular edges of furniture beneath it. Along one wall, arranged with a precision that still held after 30 years, were stacks of flat objects wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine that had gone fragile as old spider silk. I moved carefully. Reverently, almost. The first crate I opened, the smallest, nearest the door, contained books. Dozens of them, wrapped individually in cloth and packed in sawdust. I lifted one out and unwrapped it slowly. It was a journal. Handwritten, the pages dense with small, careful script. The date on the first entry, March 14, 1961. I unwrapped another. Another journal, different handwriting, same careful preservation. There were 11 journals in that first crate alone. The flat objects along the wall were paintings. When I peeled back the brown paper on the first one, gently, with hands that had started to tremble, I found a landscape. Tennessee mountains, rendered in oil with an extraordinary delicacy, light falling through valley mist in a way that felt almost photographic in its accuracy. In the lower right corner, small initials, EHBE, HB. I sat down on the floor of that railroad car with a painting in my lap and the November cold coming in through the open door, and I stared at those initials until the light changed. My mother's maiden name was Elaine Helen Beaumont. EHB. I started unwrapping paintings with hands I could barely control. Landscapes, mostly. Some portraits. A series of small still-life works, intimate and quiet, rendered with a specificity that spoke of someone who had looked very, very carefully at the world. 43 paintings total. Under the tarpaulin, the furniture, a writing desk, a rocking chair, a cedar chest. Inside the cedar chest, more journals, more letters, and at the very bottom, wrapped in velvet that had kept its burgundy color perfectly after 3 decades of sealed darkness, a photograph. My mother. Young, maybe 22, 23. Standing next to a man I didn't recognize, both of them laughing, her face open in a way I had never, not once, seen in my entire life with her. On the back of the photograph, in her handwriting, the life I couldn't keep. 1968, I took the journals home. I read them over 4 days, barely sleeping, eating things I don't remember eating. Wrapped in a blanket on the couch with the pages spread around me like a paper world that was reshaping everything I thought was solid. My mother had been an artist. Not a hobbyist. Not a weekend painter. A serious, gifted, devoted artist who had spent her early 20s working with near ferocious commitment, painting, writing. Filling journal after journal with observations about light and color and the way emotion lives in physical space. The journals were extraordinary. Her voice in those pages was nothing like the woman I knew. She was funny. She was fierce. She was tender in ways that made me ache. The man in the photograph was named Thomas Waverley. She wrote about him constantly in the early journals, a musician she'd met in Knoxville, a man who understood her work in ways that felt, she wrote, like being seen for the first time. They had planned to move to Asheville together. She had assembled everything she owned that mattered, her paintings, her journals, her desk, and arranged for a private freight car through a man Thomas knew at Southern Appalachian Regional. Someone willing to move things quietly, without a standard manifest. And then Thomas was killed in a car accident 3 weeks before they were meant to leave. She wrote about it in 3 pages that I had to stop reading twice. Not because they were overwrought, because they were so precise. So honest. The grief in those pages was clinical in its clarity, like she was documenting something she needed to survive by understanding exactly, anatomically, what it felt like. After Thomas died, she couldn't retrieve the car. The contact at SAR left the company. The mechanism was something Thomas had arranged privately, and the key, a specially machined lever key, had been with him when he died. She had tried. She had written letters to SAR for years. They couldn't locate the car in their records. It had fallen through the administrative cracks of a small company already struggling toward its own end. And so she had done what the loss demanded. She had closed the door on the person she'd been. She had become Elaine Bauer, my father's name, and built a quiet, contained life, and raised a daughter she loved in the only way she had left, which was carefully, distantly. Like someone protecting something very fragile by never touching it directly. The last journal entry was dated 1987. The year SAR folded. She wrote, "It's gone now, I think. Everything I was before is in that car, and I'll never know where it is. Maybe that's better. Maybe the person I was then needs to stay somewhere I can't reach her." And then, at the very bottom of the last page, in different ink, added later, I think, much later, some things are worth finding, even when the door won't open. She had written that. In her journal. In 1987. And then, 30 years later, on her deathbed, she had written it again on a piece of paper and left it for me. She had known I would find it. She had always known. I want to be honest about what the next weeks felt like, because I think dishonesty here would be a betrayal of everything those journals taught me. It wasn't immediately beautiful. It wasn't a clean, cinematic transformation where grief becomes clarity and clarity becomes purpose. It was complicated and it was painful, and there were nights I sat with those paintings around me feeling a rage I didn't know how to classify, at my mother for being so closed. At the years I'd lost not knowing her, at Thomas Waverley for dying, at the accident of history that had locked that car and kept it locked for 30 years. But rage, I've learned, is often just love with nowhere to go. I called Arthur Grimm and told him what I'd found. He listened without interruption, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "What are you going to do with them?" And I realized that was the only question that mattered. I contacted an art historian at Vanderbilt through a friend of a friend. She came out to my house on a Tuesday and spent 3 hours with the paintings. And by the time she left, her voice had taken on the particular careful quality of someone trying not to show how excited they are. She said my mother's work was insignificant. She said it again, as if I hadn't heard it. She said it deserved to be seen. It took 7 months. 7 months of inventory and authentication and conversations with galleries and a university archive that wanted the journals. 7 months of paperwork and phone calls and long evenings alone with my mother's handwriting, learning her in a way I never could when she was alive. The Southern Appalachian Regional Railroad car, my $4 purchase, was moved to proper storage, preserved, and eventually donated to a regional transportation museum that was thrilled to have it and completely astonished by its provenance. The paintings were exhibited in March, the same month my mother had died, 1 year earlier, at a gallery in Knoxville, 40 minutes from where she'd been born. The show was called The Life I Couldn't Keep. Her name on the wall, Elaine Helen Beaumont. Her real name. Her whole name. I stood in that gallery on opening night and looked at 43 paintings made by a woman I thought I knew and felt something settle in my chest with the quiet finality of a key turning in a lock. I was the only person in the room who cried. I cried the way I hadn't been able to at her funeral, the whole, ungraceful, necessary kind. Standing in front of a painting of Tennessee mountains with light falling through the mist in a way that felt like looking directly at her. A woman standing next to me touched my arm gently. "Did you know her?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. Really thought about it. "I'm starting to," I said. "I have her desk now. I write at it in the mornings. I'm not a painter, that talent went with her, but I've started keeping a journal of my own, because she taught me, across 30 years of silence and $4 and a locked door, that the interior life is worth preserving. That the person you are at your most alive, your most real, your most open, that person deserves to be documented. That person deserves to be found. For dollars. A locked door. 30 years of silence. I think about that auction sometimes, the ease with which people walked past lot 47, the way Gary's voice flattened when he got to it. The way that man shook his head at me like I was making a mistake. And maybe that's the thing I keep coming back to, the things that look like nothing, that cost almost nothing, that no one wants to bother with. Sometimes those are the things that carry the most. The things that have been waiting the longest. The things that have never had someone willing to do the quiet, patient, unglamorous work of finding the right key. My mother locked herself away after Thomas died. Not the paintings, herself. And I spent 38 years trying to understand a woman who had decided, out of grief and survival, to become a door that wouldn't open. But she left me the note. She left me that one line, like a breadcrumb, like a whispered instruction. She knew I would find her, eventually. She believed I would be the one willing to stand in the cold and the mud and figure out the lock that no one else would bother with. And she was right. Some things are worth finding, even when the door won't open. Especially then.